Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we are moving on to the fourth and final book of The Will to Power. This fourth book is entitled Discipline and Breeding, and the first section of this book is called The Order of Rank. And with that said, I will go ahead and get started. Aphorism 854. In this age of universal suffrage, in which everybody is allowed to sit in judgment upon everything and everybody, I feel compelled to re-establish the order of rank. 855. Quanta of power alone determine rank and distinguish rank. Nothing else does. 856. The will to power. How must those men be constituted who would undertake this transvaluation? The order of rank as the order of power. War and danger are the prerequisites which allow of a rank maintaining its conditions. The prodigious example, man in nature, the weakest and shrewdest creature making himself master and putting a yoke upon all less intelligent forces. 857. I distinguish between the type which represents ascending life and that which represents decay, decomposition, and weakness. Ought one to suppose that the question of rank between these two types can be at all doubtful? 858. The modicum of power which you represent decides your rank. All the rest is cowardice. 859. The advantages of standing detached from one's age. Detached from the two movements, that of individualism and that of collectivist morality. For even the first does not recognize the order of rank and would give one individual the same freedom as another. My thoughts are not concerned with the degree of freedom which should be granted to one or to the other or to all, but with the degree of power which the one or the other should exercise over his neighbor or over all. And more especially with the question to what extent a sacrifice of freedom, or even enslavement, may afford the basis for the cultivation of a superior type. In plain words, how could one sacrifice the development of mankind in order to assist a higher species than man to come into being? 860. Concerning rank. The terrible consequences of equality. In the end, everybody thinks he has the right to every problem. All order of rank has vanished. 861. It is necessary for higher men to declare war upon the masses. In all directions, mediocre people are joining hands in order to make themselves masters. Everything that pampers, that softens, and that brings the quote-unquote people, or women, to the front, operates in favor of universal suffrage. That is to say, the dominion of inferior men. But we must make reprisals and draw the whole state of affairs, which commenced in Europe with Christianity, to the light of day and to judgment. 862. A teaching is needed which is strong enough to work in a disciplinary manner. It should operate in such a way as to strengthen the strong and to paralyze and smash up the world-weary. The annihilation of declining races. The decay of Europe, the annihilation of slave-tainted valuations, the dominion of the world as a means to the rearing of a higher type, the annihilation of the humbug which is called morality, Christianity as a hysterical kind of honesty in this regard, Augustine, Bunyan, the annihilation of universal suffrage, that is to say, that system by means of which the lowest natures prescribe themselves as a law for higher natures, the annihilation of mediocrity and its prevalence, the one-sided, the individuals, peoples. Constitutional plenitude should be aimed at by means of the coupling of opposites. To this end, race combinations should be tried. The new kind of courage, no a priori truths. Those who were accustomed to believe in something sought such truths. But free submission to a ruling thought, which has its time, for instance, time conceived as the quality of space, etc. 2. The strong and the weak. 863. The notion strong and weak man resolve itself into this, that in the first place much strength is inherited, the man is a total sum. In other, not yet enough. Inadequate inheritance, subdivision of the inherited qualities. Weakness may be a starting phenomenon, not yet enough, or a final phenomenon, no more. The determining point is there where great strength is present, or where a great amount of strength can be discharged. The mass, as the sum total of the weak, reacts slowly. It defends itself against much for which it is too weak, against that for which it is no use. It never creates, it never takes a step forward. This is opposed to the theory which denies the strong individual and would maintain that the masses do everything. The difference is similar to that which obtains between separated generations. 4 or even 5 generations may lie between the masses and him who is the moving spirit. It is a chronological difference. The values of the weak are in the van, because the strong have adopted them in order to lead with them. 864. Why the weak triumph? On the whole, the sick and the weak have more sympathy and are more humane. The sick and the weak have more intellect and are more changeable, more variegated, more entertaining, more malicious. The sick alone invented malice. A morbid precocity is often to be observed among rickety, scropholitic, and tuberculous people. Esprit. The property of older races, Jews, Frenchmen, Chinese. The anti-Semites do not forgive the Jews for having both intellect and money. Anti-Semites, another name for bungled and botched. The sick and the weak have always had fascination on their side. They are more interesting than the healthy. The fool and the saint, the two most interesting kinds of men. Closely related thereto is the genius. The great adventurers and criminals, and all great men, the most healthy in particular, have always been sick at certain periods of their lives. Great disturbances of the emotions, the passion for power, love, revenge are all accompanied by very profound perturbations. And as for decadence, every man who does not die prematurely manifests it in almost every respect. He therefore knows from experience the instincts which belong to it. For half his life nearly every man is decadent. And finally, woman. One half of mankind is weak, chronically sick, changeable, shifty woman requires strength in order to cleave to it. She also requires a religion of the weak which glorifies weakness, love, and modesty as divine. Or, better still, she makes the strong weak. She rules when she succeeds in overcoming the strong. Woman has always conspired with decadent types. The priests, for instance, against the mighty, against the strong, against men. Women avail themselves of children for the cult of piety, pity, and love. The mother stands as the symbol of convincing altruism. Finally, the increase of civilization with its necessary correlatives, the increase of morbid elements, of the neurotic and psychiatric, and of the criminal. A sort of intermediary species arises, the artist. He is distinct from those who are criminals as the result of weak wills and of the fear of society, although they may not yet be ripe for the asylum. But he has antennas which grope inquisitively into both spheres, this specific plant of culture, the modern artist, painter, musician, and above all novelist, who designates his particular kind of attitude with the very indefinite word, naturalism. Lunatics, criminals, and realists are on the increase. This is the sign of a growing culture plunging forward at headlong speed. That is to say, its excrement, its refuse, the rubbish that is shot from it every day, is beginning to acquire more importance. The retrogressive movement keeps pace with the advance. Finally, the social mishmash, which is the result of revolution, of the establishment of equal rights, and of the superstition, the equality of man. Thus, the possessors of the instincts of decline, of resentment, of discontent, of the lust of destruction, of anarchy and nihilism, as also the instincts of slavery, of cowardice, of craftiness, and of rascality, which are inherent among those classes of society which have long been suppressed, are beginning to get infused into the blood of all ranks. 2 or 3 generations later, the race can no longer be recognized. Everything has become mob. And thus there results a collective instinct against selection, against every kind of privilege. And this instinct operates with such power, certainty, hardness, and cruelty that, as a matter of fact, in the end even the privileged classes have to submit. All those who still wish to hold on to the power flatter the mob, work with the mob, and must have the mob on their side. The geniuses above all. The latter become the heralds of those feelings with which the mob can be inspired. The expression of pity, of honor, even for all that suffers, all that is low and despised, and has lived under persecution, becomes predominant. Types: Victor Hugo, Richard Wagner. The rise of the mob signifies once more the rise of old values. In the case of such an extreme movement, both in tempo and in means as characterizes our civilization, man's ballast is shifted. Those men whose worth is greatest, and whose mission, as it were, is to compensate for the very great danger of such a morbid movement, such men become dawdlers par excellence. They are slow to accept anything, and are tenacious. They are creatures that are relatively lasting in the midst of this vast mingling and changing of elements. In such circumstances, power is necessarily relegated to the mediocre. Mediocrity, as the trustee and bearer of the future, consolidates itself against the rule of the mob and of eccentricities, both of which are, in most cases, united. In this way, a new antagonist is evolved, for exceptional men, or in certain cases, a new temptation. Provided that they do not adapt themselves to the mob and stand up for what satisfies the instinct of the disinherited, they will find it necessary to be mediocre and sound. They know mediocritas is also aurea. It alone has command of money and gold, of all that glitters. And once more, old virtue and the whole superannuated world of ideals in general secures a gifted host of special pleaders. Result: mediocrity acquires intellect, wit, and genius. It becomes entertaining and even seductive. Result: a high culture can only stand upon a broad basis, upon a strongly and soundly consolidated mediocrity. In its service and assisted by it, science and even art do their work. Science could not wish for a better state of affairs. In its essence, it belongs to a middle-class type of man. Among exceptions, it is out of place. There is not anything aristocratic, and still less anything anarchic in its instincts. The power of the middle classes is then upheld by means of commerce, but above all by means of money-dealing. The instinct of great financiers is opposed to everything extreme. On this account, the Jews are, for the present, the most conservative power in the threatening and insecure conditions of modern Europe. They can have no use either for revolutions, for socialism, or for militarism. If they would have power, and if they should need it, even over the revolutionary party, this is only the result of what I have already said, and it in no way contradicts it. Against other extreme movements, they may occasionally require to excite terror by showing how much power is in their hands. But their instinct itself is inveterately conservative and, quote-unquote, mediocre. Whereas power exists, they know how to become mighty. But the application of their power always takes the same direction. The polite term for mediocre, as is well known, is the word liberal. Reflection. It is all nonsense to suppose that this general conquest of values is anti-biological. In order to explain it, we ought to try and show that it is the result of a certain interest of life to maintain the type man, even by means of this method which leads to the prevalence of the weak and the physiologically botched. If things were otherwise, might man not cease to exist? Problem. The enhancement of the type may prove fatal to the maintenance of the species. Why? The experience of history shows that strong races decimate each other mutually by means of war, lust for power, and venturousness. The strong emotions, wastefulness, strength is no longer capitalized. Disturbed mental systems arise from excessive tension. Their existence is a costly affair. In short, they persistently give rise to friction between themselves. Periods of profound slackness and torpidity intervene. All great ages have to be paid for. The strong are, after all, weaker, less willful, and more absurd than the average weak ones. They are squandering races. Permanence in itself can have no value. That which ought to be preferred thereto would be a shorter life for the species, but a life richer in creations. It would remain to be proved that, even as things are, a richer sum of creations is attained than in the case of the shorter existence, i.e., that man as a storehouse of power attains to a much higher degree of dominion over things under the conditions which have existed hitherto. We are here face to face with the problem of economics. 865. The state of mind which calls itself idealism, and which will neither allow mediocrity to be mediocre, nor woman to be woman, do not make everything uniform. We should have a clear idea of how dearly we have to pay for the establishment of a virtue, and that virtue is nothing generally desirable, but a noble piece of madness, a beautiful exception which gives us the privilege of feeling elated. 866. It is necessary to show that a counter-movement is inevitably associated with any increasingly economical consumption of men and mankind, and with an ever more closely involved machinery of interests and services. I call this counter-movement the separation of the luxurious surplus of mankind. By means of it, a stronger kind, a higher type must come to light, which has other conditions for its origin and for its maintenance than the average man. My concept, my metaphor for this type is, as you know, the word Superman. Along the first road, which can now be completely surveyed, arose adaptation, stultification, higher Chinese culture, modesty in the instincts, and satisfaction at the sight of the belittlement of man, a kind of stationary level of mankind. If ever we get that inevitable and imminent general control of the economy of the earth, then mankind can be used as machinery and find its best purpose in the service of this economy, as an enormous piece of clockwork consisting of ever smaller and ever more subtly adapted wheels. Then all the dominating and commanding elements will become ever more superfluous, and the whole gains enormous energy, while the individual factors which compose it represent but small modicums of strength and of value. To oppose this dwarfing and adaptation of man to a specialized kind of utility, a reverse movement is needed, the procreation of the synthetic man, who embodies everything and justifies it, that man for whom the turning of mankind into a machine is a first condition of existence, for whom the rest of mankind is but soil on which he can devise his higher mode of existence. He is in need of the opposition of the masses, of those who are leveled down. He requires that feeling of distance from them. He stands upon them. He lives on them. This higher form of aristocracy is the form of the future. From the moral point of view, the collective machinery above described, that solidarity of all wheels, represents the most extreme example in the exploitation of mankind. But it presupposes the existence of those for whom such an exploitation would have some meaning. Otherwise it would signify, as a matter of fact, merely the general depreciation of the type man, a retrograde phenomenon on a grand scale. Readers are beginning to see what I am combating, namely economic optimism, as if the general welfare of everybody must necessarily increase with the growing self-sacrifice of everybody. The very reverse seems to me to be the case. The self-sacrifice of everybody amounts to a collective loss. Man becomes inferior, so that nobody knows what end this monstrous purpose has served. A wherefore, a new wherefore. This is what mankind requires. 867. The recognition of the increase of collective power. We should calculate to what extent the ruin of individuals, of castes, of ages, and of peoples is included in this general increase. The transposition of the ballast of a culture. The cost of every vast growth. Who bears it? Why must it be enormous at the present time? 868. General aspect of the future European. The latter regarded as the most intelligent servile animal, very industrious, at bottom very modest, inquisitive to excess, multifarious, pampered, weak of will, a chaos of cosmopolitan passions and intelligences. How would it be possible for a stronger race to be bred from him? Such a race as would have classical taste? The classical taste, this is the will to simplicity, to accentuation, and to happiness made visible, the will to the terrible, and the courage for psychological nakedness. Simplification is the outcome of the will to accentuate, allowing happiness as well as nakedness to become visible is a consequence of the will to the terrible. In order to fight one's way out of that chaos and up to this form, a certain disciplinary constraint is necessary. A man should have to choose between either going to the dogs or prevailing. A ruling race can only arise amid terrible and violent conditions. Problem: where are the barbarians of the 20th century? Obviously, they will only show themselves and consolidate themselves after enormous socialistic crises. They will consist of those elements which are capable of the greatest hardness towards themselves, and which can guarantee the most enduring willpower. 869. The mightiest and most dangerous passions of man, by means of which he most easily goes to rack and ruin, have been so fundamentally banned that mighty men themselves have either become impossible or else must regard themselves as evil, quote, harmful and prohibited, end quote. The losses are heavy, but up to the present they have been necessary. Now, however, that a whole host of counterforces has been reared, by means of the temporary suppression of these passions, the passion for dominion, the love of change and deception, their liberation has once more become possible. They will no longer possess their old savagery. We can now allow ourselves this tame sort of barbarism. Look at our artists and our statesmen. 870. The root of all evil, that the slave morality of modesty, chastity, selflessness, and absolute obedience should have triumphed. Dominating natures were thus condemned, 1. To hypocrisy, 2. To qualms of conscience. Creative natures regarded themselves as rebels against God, uncertain and hemmed in by eternal values. The barbarians showed that the ability of keeping within the bounds of moderation was not in the scope of their powers. They feared and slandered the passions and instincts of nature. Likewise, the aspect of the ruling Caesars and castes. On the other hand, there arose the suspicion that all restraint is a form of weakness or of incipient old age and fatigue. Thus, La Rochefoucauld suspects that virtue is only a euphemism in the mouths of those to whom vice no longer affords any pleasure. The capacity for restraint was represented as a matter of hardness, self-control, asceticism, as a fight with the devil, etc., etc. The natural delight of aesthetic natures, in measure, the pleasure derived from the beauty of measure, was overlooked and denied, because that which was desired was anti-eudaimonistic morality. The belief in the pleasure which comes of restraint has been lacking hitherto. This pleasure of a rider on a fiery steed, the moderation of weak natures was confounded with the restraint of the strong. In short, the best things have been blasphemed because weak or immoderate swine have thrown a bad light upon them. The best men have remained concealed, and have often misunderstood themselves. 871. Vicious and unbridled people. Their depressing influence upon the value of the passions. It was the appalling barbarity of morality which was principally responsible in the Middle Ages for the compulsory recourse to a veritable League of Virtue, and this was coupled with an equally appalling exaggeration of all that which constitutes the value of man. Militant civilization, taming, is in need of all kinds of irons and tortures in order to maintain itself against terrible and beast-of-prey natures. In this case, contusion, although it may have the most nefarious influences, is quite natural. That which men of power and will are able to demand of themselves gives them the standard for what they may also allow themselves. Such natures are very opposite of the vicious and the unbridled, although under certain circumstances they may perpetrate deeds for which an inferior man would be convicted of vice and intemperance. In this respect, the concept, all men are equal before God, does an extraordinary amount of harm. Actions and attitudes of mind were forbidden which belong to the prerogative of the strong alone, just as if they were in themselves unworthy of man. All the tendencies of strong men were brought into disrepute by the fact that the defensive weapons of the most weak, even of those who were the weakest towards themselves, were established as a standard of valuation. The confusion went so far that precisely the great virtuosos of life, whose self-control presents the sharpest contrast to the vicious and the unbridled, were branded with the most opprobrious names. Even to this day, people feel themselves compelled to disparage a Caesar Borgia. It is simply ludicrous. The Church has anathematized German Kaisers owing to their vices, as if a monk or a priest had the right to say a word as to what a Frederick II should allow himself. Don Juan is sent to hell. This is very naive. Has anybody ever noticed that all interesting men are lacking in heaven? This is only a hint to the girls as to where they may best find salvation. If one think at all logically, and also have a profound insight into that which makes a great man, there can be no doubt at all that the Church has dispatched all great men to Hades. Its fight is against all greatness in man. 872. The rights which a man arrogates to himself are relative to the duties which he sets himself, and to the task which he feels capable of performing. The great majority of men have no right to life, and are only a misfortune to their higher fellows. 873. The misunderstanding of egoism. On the part of ignoble natures who know nothing of the lust of conquest and the insatiability of great love, and who likewise know nothing of the overflowing feelings of power which makes a man wish to overcome things, to force them over to himself, and to lay them on his heart, the power which impels an artist to his material, it often happens also that the active spirit looks for a field for its activity. In ordinary egoism, it is precisely the non-ego, the profoundly mediocre creature, the member of the herd who wishes to maintain himself, and when this is perceived by the rarer, more subtle, and less mediocre natures, it revolts them. For the judgments of the latter is this: we are the noble. It is much more important to maintain us than that cattle. 874. The degeneration of the ruler and of the ruling classes has been the cause of all the great disorders in history. Without Roman Caesars and Roman society, Christianity would never have prevailed. When it occurs to inferior men to doubt whether higher men exist, then the danger is great. It is then that men finally discover that there are virtues even among inferior, suppressed, and poor-spirited men, and that everybody is equal before God, which is the non plus ultra of all confounded nonsense that has ever appeared on earth. For in the end, higher men begin to measure themselves according to the standard of virtues upheld by the slaves, and discover that they are proud, etc., and that all their higher qualities should be condemned. When Nero and Caracalla stood at the helm, it was then that the paradox arose. Quote, "The lowest man is of more value than that one on the throne," end quote. And thus the path was prepared for an image of God, which was as remote as possible from the image of the mightiest, God on the cross. 875. Higher man and gregarious man. When great men are wanting, the great of the past are converted into demigods or whole gods. The rise of religions proves that mankind no longer has any pleasure in man, nor in woman neither, as in Hamlet's case. Or a host of men are brought together in a heap, and it is hoped that as a parliament they will operate just as tyrannically. Tyrannizing is the distinctive quality of great men. They make inferior men stupid. 876. Buckle affords the best example of the extent to which a plebeian agitator of the mob is incapable of arriving at a clear idea of the concept higher nature. The opinion which he combats so passionately, that great men, individuals, princes, statesmen, geniuses, warriors are the levers and causes of all great movements, is instinctively misunderstood by him, as if it meant that all that was essential and valuable in such a higher man was the fact that he was capable of setting masses in motion. In short, that his sole merit was the effect he produced. But the higher nature of the great man resides precisely in being different, in being unable to communicate with others, and the loftiness of his rank, not in any sort of effect he may produce, even though this be the shattering of both hemispheres. 877. The revolution made Napoleon possible. That is its justification. We ought to desire the anarchical collapse of the whole of our civilization, if such a reward were to be its result. Napoleon made nationalism possible. That is the latter's excuse. The value of a man, apart of course from morality and immorality, because with these concepts a man's worth is not even skimmed, does not lie in his utility, because he would continue to exist even if there were nobody to whom he could be useful. And why could not that man be the very pinnacle of manhood, who was the source of the worst possible effects for his race, so high and so superior that in his presence everything would go to rack and ruin from envy? 878. To appraise the value of a man according to his utility to mankind, or according to what he costs it, or the damage he is able to inflict upon it, is just as good and just as bad as it to appraise the value of a work of art according to its effects. But in this way the value of one man compared with another is not even touched upon. The quote-unquote moral valuation, insofar as it is social, measures men altogether according to their effects. But what about the man who has his own taste on his tongue, who is surrounded and concealed by his isolation, uncommunicative and not to be communicated with, a man whom no one has fathomed yet, that is to say, a creature of a higher and at any rate different species? How would ye appraise his worth, seeing that ye cannot know him and can compare him with nothing? Moral valuation was the cause of the most enormous obtuseness of judgment. The value of a man in himself is underrated, well nigh overlooked, practically denied. This is the remains of simple-minded teleology. The value of man can only be measured with regard to other men. 879. To be obsessed by moral considerations presupposes a very low grade of intellect. It shows that the instinct for special rights, for standing apart, the feeling of freedom and creative natures in children of God or of the devil is lacking. And irrespective of whether he preaches a ruling morality or criticizes the prevailing ethical code from the point of view of his own ideal, by doing these things a man shows that he belongs to the herd, even though he may be what it is most in need of, that is to say, a shepherd. 880. We should substitute morality by the will to our own ends, and consequently to the means to them. 881. Concerning the order of rank. What is it that constitutes the mediocrity of the typical man? That he does not understand that things necessarily have their other side, that he combats evil conditions as if they should be dispensed with, that he will not take the one with the other, that he would fain obliterate and erase the specific character of a thing, of a circumstance, of an age, and of a person, by calling only a portion of their qualities good, and suppressing the remainder. The desirability of the mediocre is that which we others combat. Their ideal is something which shall no longer contain anything harmful, evil, dangerous, questionable, and destructive. We recognize the reverse of this, that with every growth of man his other side must grow as well. That the highest man, if such a concept be allowed, would be that man who would represent the antagonistic character of existence most strikingly, and would be its glory and its only justification. Ordinary men may only represent a small corner and nook of this natural character. They perish the moment the multifariousness of the elements composing them, and the tension between their antagonistic traits, increases. But this is the prerequisite for greatness in man. That man should become better, and at the same time more evil, is my formula for this inevitable fact. The majority of people are only piecemeal and fragmentary examples of man. Only when all these creatures are jumbled together does one whole man arise. Whole ages and whole peoples, in this sense, have a fragmentary character about them. It may perhaps be part of the economy of human development that man should develop himself only piecemeal. But for this reason, one should not forget that the only important consideration is the rise of the synthetic man, that inferior men, and by far the great majority of people, are but rehearsals and exercises out of which here and there a whole man may arise. A man who is a human milestone, and who indicates how far mankind has advanced up to a certain point. Mankind does not advance in a straight line. Often a type is attained which is again lost. For instance, with all the efforts of 300 years, we have not reached the men of the Renaissance again. And in addition to this, we must not forget that the man of the Renaissance was already behind his brother of classical antiquity. 882. The superiority of the Greek and the man of the Renaissance is recognized, but people would like to produce them without the conditions and causes of which they were the result. 883. Purification of taste can only be the result of the strengthening of the type. Our society today represents only the cultivating systems. The cultivated man is lacking. The great synthetic man, in whom the various forces for attaining a purpose are correctly harnessed together, is altogether wanting. The specimen we possess is the multifarious man, the most interesting form of chaos that has ever existed, but not the chaos preceding the creation of the world, but that following it. Goethe as the most beautiful expression of the type, completely and utterly un-Olympian. 884. Handel, Leibniz, Goethe, and Bismarck are characteristic of the strong German type. They lived with equanimity, surrounded by contrasts. They were full of that agile kind of strength which cautiously avoids convictions and doctrines by using the one as a weapon against the other, and reserving absolute freedom for themselves. 885. Of this I am convinced, that if the rise of great and rare men had been made dependent upon the voices of the multitude, taking for granted, of course, that the latter knew the qualities which belong to greatness, and also the price that all greatness pays for its self-development, then there would never have been any such thing as a great man. The fact that things pursue their course independently of the voice of the many is the reason why a few astonishing things have taken place on earth. 886. The order of rank and human values. A. A man should not be valued according to isolated acts. Epidermal actions. Nothing is more rare than a personal act. Class, rank, race, environment, accident. All these things are much more likely to be expressed in an action or deed than the personality of the doer. B. We should on no account jump to the conclusion that there are many people who are personalities. Some men are but conglomerations of personalities, whilst the majority are not even one. In all cases in which those average qualities preponderate, which ensure the maintenance of the species, to be a personality would involve unnecessary expense. It would be a luxury, in fact. It would be foolish to demand of anybody that he should be a personality. In such circumstances, everybody is a channel or a transmitting vessel. C. A quote-unquote personality is a relatively isolated phenomenon, in view of the superior importance of the continuation of the race at an average level. A personality might even be regarded as something hostile to nature. For a personality to be possible, timely isolation and the necessity for an existence of offense and defense are prerequisites. Something in the nature of a walled enclosure, a capacity for shutting out the world, but above all a much lower degree of sensitiveness than the average man has, who is too easily infected with the views of others. The first question concerning the order of rank. How far is a man disposed to be solitary or gregarious? In the latter case, his value consists in those qualities which secure the survival of his tribe or his type. In the former case, his qualities are those which distinguish him from others, which isolate and defend him, and make his solitude possible. Consequence. The solitary type should not be valued from the standpoint of the gregarious type, or vice versa. Viewed from above, both types are necessary, as is likewise their antagonism. And nothing is more thoroughly reprehensible than the desire which would help develop a third thing out of the two, virtue as hermaphroditism. This is as little worthy of desire as the equalization and reconciliation of the sexes. The distinguishing qualities must be developed ever more and more. The gulf must be made ever wider. The concept of degeneration in both cases. The approximation of the qualities of the herd to those of solitary creatures, and vice versa. In short, when they begin to resemble each other. This concept of degeneration is beyond the sphere of moral judgments. 887. Where the strongest natures are to be sought. The ruin and degeneration of the solitary species is much greater and more terrible. They have the instincts of the herd and the tradition of values against them. Their weapons of defense, their instincts of self-preservation are from the beginning insufficiently strong and reliable. Fortune must be peculiarly favorable to them if they are to prosper. They prosper best in the lowest ranks and dregs of society. If ye are seeking personalities, it is there that you will find them, with much greater certainty than in the middle classes. When the dispute between ranks and classes, which aims at equality of rights, is almost settled, the fight will begin against the solitary person. In a certain sense, the latter can maintain and develop himself most easily in a democratic society. There, where the coarser means of defense are no longer necessary, and a certain habit of order, honesty, justice, trust is already a general condition. The strongest must be most tightly bound, most strictly watched, laid in chains and supervised. This is the instinct of the herd. To them belongs a regime of self-mastery, of ascetic detachment, of duties, consisting in exhausting work, in which one can no longer call one's soul one's own. 888. I am attempting an economic justification of virtue. The object is to make man as useful as possible, and to make him approximate as nearly as one can to an infallible machine. To this end he must be equipped with machine-like virtues. He must learn to value those states in which he works in a most mechanically useful way, as the highest of all. To this end it is necessary to make him as disgusted as possible with the other states, and to represent them as very dangerous and despicable. Here is the first stumbling block, the tediousness and monotony which all mechanical activity brings with it. To learn to endure this, and not only to endure it, but to see tedium envelop in a ray of exceeding charm. This hitherto has been the task of all higher schools. To learn something which you don't care a fig about, and to find precisely your duty in this objective activity. To learn to value happiness and duty as things apart. This is the invaluable task and performance of higher schools. It is on this account that the philologist has hitherto been the educator per se, because his activity in itself affords the best pattern of magnificent monotony in action. Under his banner, youths learn to swat. First prerequisite for the thorough fulfillment of mechanical duties in the future, as state officials, husbands, slaves of the desk, newspaper readers, and soldiers. Such an existence may perhaps require a philosophical glorification and justification more than any other. Pleasurable feelings must be valued by some sort of infallible tribunal, as altogether of inferior rank. Duty per se, perhaps even the pathos of reverence in regard to everything unpleasant, must be demanded imperatively as that which is above all useful, delightful, and practical things. A mechanical form of existence, regarded as the highest and most respectable form of existence, worshipping itself. Type, Comte as the fanatic of the formal concept, thou shalt. 889. The economic evaluation of all the ideals that have existed hitherto, that is to say, the selection and rearing of definite passions and states at the cost of other passions and states. The lawgiver, or the instinct of the community, selects a number of states and passions the existence of which guarantees the performance of regular actions. Mechanical actions would thus be the result of the regular requirements of those passions and states. In the event of these states and passions containing ingredients which were painful, a means would have to be found for overcoming this painfulness by means of evaluation. Pain would have to be interpreted as something valuable, as something pleasurable in a higher sense. Conceived in a formula, how does something unpleasant become pleasant? For instance, when our obedience and our submission to the law become honored, thanks to the energy, power, and self-control they entail. The same holds good of our public spirit, of our neighborliness, of our patriotism, our humanization, our altruism, and our heroism. The object of all idealism should be to induce people to do unpleasant things cheerfully. 890. The belittlement of man must be held as the chief aim for a long while, because what is needed in the first place is a broad basis from which a stronger species of man may arise. To what extent hitherto has every stronger species of man arisen from a substratum of inferior people? 891. The absurd and contemptible form of idealism, which would not have mediocrity mediocre, and which instead of feeling triumphant at being exceptional, becomes indignant at cowardice, falseness, pettiness, and wretchedness. We should not wish things to be any different. We should make the gulfs even wider. The higher types among men should be compelled to distinguish themselves by means of the sacrifices which they make to their own existence. Principal point of view. Distances must be established, but no contrast must be created. The middle classes must be dissolved, and their influence decreased. This is the principal means of maintaining distances. 892. Who would dare to discuss the mediocre of their mediocrity? As you observe, I do precisely the reverse. Every step away from mediocrity, thus do I teach, leads to immorality. 893. To hate mediocrity is unworthy of a philosopher. It is almost a note of interrogation to his right to philosophy. It is precisely because he is the exception that he must protect the rule and ingratiate all mediocre people. 894. What I combat, that an exceptional form should make war upon the rule, instead of understanding that the continued existence of the rule is the first condition of the value of the exception. For instance, there are women who, instead of considering their abnormal thirst for knowledge as a distinction, would fain dislocate the whole status of womanhood. 895. The increase of strength, despite the temporary ruin of the individual. A new level must be established. We must have a method of storing up forces for the maintenance of small performances, in opposition to economic waste. Destructive nature must for once be reduced to an instrument of this economy of the future. The weak must be maintained, because there is an enormous mass of finicking work to be done. The weak and the suffering must be upheld in their belief that existence is still possible. Solidarity must be implanted as an instinct opposed to the instinct of fear and servility. War must be made upon accident, even upon the accident of, quote, the great man, end quote. 896. War upon great men justified in economic grounds. Great men are dangerous. They are accidents, exceptions, tempests, which are strong enough to question things which it has taken time to build and establish. Explosive material must not only be discharged harmlessly, but if possible, its discharge must be prevented altogether. This is the fundamental instinct of all civilized society. 897. He who thinks over the question of how the type man may be elevated to its highest glory and power will realize from the start that he must place himself beyond morality, for morality was directed in its essentials at the opposite goal. That is to say, its aim was to arrest and to annihilate that glorious development wherever it was in process of accomplishment. For as a matter of fact, development of that sort implies that such an enormous number of men must be subservient to it, that a counter-movement is only too natural. The weaker, more delicate, more mediocre existences find it necessary to take up sides against that glory of life and power, and for that purpose they must get a new valuation of themselves, by means of which they are able to condemn, and if possible to destroy, life in this high degree of plenitude. Morality is therefore essentially the expression of hostility to life, insofar as it would overcome vital types. 898. The strong of the future. To what extent necessity on the one hand and accident on the other have attained to conditions from which a stronger species may be reared. This we are now able to understand and to bring about consciously. We can now create those conditions under which such an elevation is possible. Hitherto, education has always aimed at the utility of society, not the greatest possible utility for the future, but the utility of the society actually extant. What people required were instruments for this purpose. Provided the wealth of forces were greater, it would be possible to think of a draft being made upon them, the aim of which would not be the utility of society, but some future utility. The more people grasped to what extent the present form of society was in such a state of transition as sooner or later to be no longer able to exist for its own sake, but only as a means in the hands of a stronger race, the more this task would have to be brought forward. The increasing belittlement of man in precisely the impelling power which leads one to think of the cultivation of a stronger race, a race which would have a surplus precisely there where the dwarfed species was weak and growing weaker. Will, responsibility, self-reliance, the ability to postulate aims for oneself. The means would be those which history teaches. Isolation by means of preservative interests, which would be the reverse of those generally accepted. Exercise in transvalued valuations. Distance as pathos. A clean conscience and what today is most despised and most prohibited. The leveling of the mankind of Europe is the great process which should not be arrested. It should even be accelerated. The necessity of cleaving gulfs, of distance, of the order of rank is therefore imperative, but not the necessity of retarding the process above mentioned. This leveled-down species requires justification as soon as it is attained. Its justification is that it exists for the service of a higher and sovereign race, which stands upon it and can only be elevated upon its shoulders to the task which it is destined to perform. Not only a ruling race whose task would be consummated in ruling alone, but a race with vital spheres of its own, with an overflow of energy for beauty, bravery, culture, and manners, even for the most abstract thought. A yea-saying race which would be able to allow itself every kind of great luxury, strong enough to be able to dispense with the tyranny of the imperatives of virtue, rich enough to be in no need of economy or pedantry, beyond good and evil, a forcing house for rare and exceptional talents. 899. Our psychologists, whose glance dwells involuntarily upon the symptoms of decadence, leads us to mistrust intellect ever more and more. People persist in seeing only the weakening, pampering, and sickening effects of intellect, but there are now going to appear new barbarians, cynics, experimentalists, conquerors, the union of intellectual superiority with well-being and an overflow of strength. 900. I point to something new. Certainly for such a democratic community there is a danger of barbarians, but these are sought only down below. There is also another kind of barbarians who come from the heights, a kind of conquering and ruling natures, which are in search of material that they can mold. Prometheus was a barbarian of this stamp. This is the end of Part 11 of Book 4 of The Will to Power by Friedrich Nietzsche. Thank you for listening.